My dad worked for the Boston Maine Railroad, hired out in 1912. I got out of high school in 1938, the height of the Depression, and I went to work October 28th, 1939, for the Boston Maine. B&M was a great company to work for. It was like a family. 1946, 47, John L. Lewis had the railroads tied up with a coal strike. And the local freight that I was working on the Lexington branch was only working 3 days a week, 16 hours a day. At those days, we worked 16 hours. So I decided to make a move to passenger service, which I did. And being familiar with the Lexington branch, I took a job out of Bedford. I worked as a trainman out here from 1948. And until you get enough seniority as a conductor, these jobs are all set up on a seniority basis. I stayed out here until probably the middle 50s, and I worked on a branch out of Stoneham, and also moved over to the Clinton branch, and I worked out of Lowell until I bid off the job when the conductor retired in 1967. And I worked on the Lexington branch until 1977 when they closed it. And that was considered a pretty good job here. Any closed terminal was considered a good job. We did work 5 days a week, and a lot of people rode the trains in the 40s, 50s. When I first came out here, there were, roughly those cars held about 85, 90 people. We'd have 7 cars. That's 700 people. That was a heavy train. You turn seats the night before, so they'd be ready for the morning. Usually about 45 minutes to an hour, go over to the engine house and let the engine out and hook it up to the train and check the steam heat. They had steam heat set up here for the cars that were fed the steam from the engine house, piped out. And then we'd pull the train down probably 20 minutes before the leaving time. And when the engineer, as soon as he left the station leaving here, he'd make a running test of his brakes. And we used to have to register the train here before you left, the register book. And then when you arrived down at the Fens, it showed on the tower at Waltham Tower that you had cleared. And we had block stations at Lexington and Arlington, and no trains were allowed in there until the other one cleared. This was considered one of the good jobs for the engineers. I worked with an engineer called John Kempton out of here. We used to go from here to Boston, and then we made a trip to Lowell and back. And then in the afternoon, we had the 405 to Lowell and back, and then we came out here. And usually had the same equipment, and when the passenger count dropped off, when you get to Boston coming from Lowell, they'd cut cars off and they'd come out here. When I came out here, we were down to 2 cars, and it was all Bud cars then. Most of your delay was getting out of Boston. There were a lot of delays at the Fens where Waltham controlled those switches where you left the Fitchburg main line to cross over onto the branch. And then you had that freight cutoff which you crossed. There would be trouble there with signals. That was supposed to be automatic. If you approached coming south on the Lexington branch and there was nothing in the circuit, you would get a green. Now, if there was a freight that was in the circuit, you'd get the red. Many's the morning you get down there, there was nothing, and there was the red. You couldn't go by until you called Waltham. So you go down and get on the New England phone somewhere, and that took time. We were forever hitting cars at crossings that had the lights. Flashing lights, it meant nothing to people that drive. They pull up, see the lights go, and pull right in front of you. We never killed anybody, but we did an awful lot of damage to automobiles. When we were running the trains in the 40s, they had a man at Arlington Center. The engineer would come right down here and stop. And by that time we were ready and everybody was loaded. He'd have everything stopped with the bells and the lights and so forth. We never had a problem there. I don't ever remember hitting a car there. And that's pretty busy crossing.
It is.
Probably the nicest people. I can remember I had a little heart problem in '74 and at the Sims Hospital, and I got more cards and a couple of bottles of wine. I did. Yeah, they were very kind out here. Charlie, yeah, he notorious for being late. His shirt tail would be flying. He'd have a piece of toast in one hand and whatever he had, books or something in the other. And the engineer would blow the whistle. Everybody would roar. That's, you lose a minute or two, but what did it amount to? Give you a little story. One of these used to be on the rear end of the 2-car. Coming out of Boston, you had a regular gang that used to stand around, shoot the breeze, all the guys. And it turned out to be quite a bar car. They had little nips, and they'd bring their whatever they had. They never might have got a little loud. And of course, people would be coming through here to detrain or unload or whatever you want to call it. And I got a letter from the train master that I would do what I could as far as stopping the drinking. Needless to say, I said nothing, and everything went well. We didn't know it was going to be our last trip. It was a storm, the ice, when they had so much trouble getting out here with the Jordan spreader, and they couldn't make it, and they had to wait more or less for a thaw before they could come out to get the equipment. And they had told us then that's going to be the end of it. I went back to Lowell, and I worked there until I retired in 1990. Seems like only yesterday, but it was 51 years. And one thing I might mention, that when I retired, I was the #1 man on the Amtrak roster in the country. Train for the Lexington Branch, making stops at Cambridge, Lake Street, Arlington, East Lexington, Pierce's Bridge, Monroe, Lexington, North Lexington, and Bedford.